In A First-Rate Madness, Nassir Ghaemi challenges the common belief that mentally healthy leaders are always best suited to lead. Instead, he argues that in times of crisis, leaders with mental illness, particularly depression, mania, or bipolar disorder, often outperform their mentally healthy counterparts. Drawing on psychology and history, Ghaemi suggests that while stability and conformity are assets in peaceful times, traits associated with mental illness, such as realism, empathy, creativity, and resilience, can be critical during periods of crisis. For instance, depression tends to make people more attuned to suffering and more grounded in reality. This made figures like Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr. especially perceptive and compassionate leaders. Mania, on the other hand, brings high energy, creativity, and boldness, traits evident in leaders like Franklin Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy, who exhibited hyperthymic, mildly manic traits. Ghaemi argues that the very symptoms often seen as weaknesses were, in times of turmoil, the sources of their strength. However, the book doesn't claim this pattern is universal. There are exceptions such as Adolf Hitler, who was a mentally ill leader and failed, as well as mentally healthy ones who succeeded. Nonetheless, Ghaemi maintains the trend is significant. He contrasts successful mentally ill leaders with mentally stable ones who struggle during crisis, such as George W. Bush and Richard Nixon. With all that said, diagnosing historical figures is inherently tricky. Ghaemi uses a combination of 4 criteria: symptoms, genetics, the course of illness over a lifetime, and treatment history to build his case. He's careful to distinguish depression from everyday sadness and explains that mental illness does not necessarily impair clarity of thought, but often affects moods. Depression can lead to despair, fatigue, loss of interest, and even suicidal ideation, but it can also enhance realism and insight. Mania, conversely, brings bursts of energy, creativity, confidence, and sociability, but can lead to reckless behavior, impulsivity, and ruinous choices. In bipolar disorder, both sets of traits coexist, amplifying the risks and sometimes the leadership potential. Ghaemi's argument about depression and realism is supported by psychological studies that reveal how people perceive control and success. In a 1979 study, students were asked to press a button to see if it would light up a green bulb, though the light was actually controlled by the researchers. Depressed students more accurately recognized when they had no control, while non-depressed students consistently overestimated their influence. This phenomenon was called depressive realism, even when money was involved. Earning $5 when the light turned on, non-depressed students believed they had more control if they profited, whereas depressed students remained realistic, regardless of reward or loss. Similarly, breast cancer patients often experience a boost in optimism and personal growth, but many also overestimate their control over the disease and their chances of survival. Interestingly, this unrealistic optimism is linked to better psychological adjustment. It highlights a broader point. What we commonly define as mental health often involves positive illusions, overestimating our abilities, control, and future. In contrast, depression can bring painful clarity. While too much realism may lead to despair and too little to delusion, Ghaemi suggests that a balanced understanding of one's limits, often sharpened by hardship, can lead to better leadership and decision-making in times of crisis. Ultimately, A First-Rate Madness doesn't glamorize mental illness but reframes it, not as a flaw to be hidden, but as a potential source of extraordinary leadership in extraordinary times. An example that illustrates Ghaemi's argument is the contrast between Winston Churchill and Neville Chamberlain in the lead-up to World War II. Churchill, who had a mild form of bipolar disorder and struggled with depression, what he famously called his black dog, had a more realistic view of Hitler's threat. He opposed appeasement and urged for military readiness and alliances, warning that concessions would only embolden Nazi Germany. Chamberlain, who was mentally healthy, believed Hitler could be reasoned with, and famously signed the 1938 Munich Agreement. Churchill's grim outlook allowed him to foresee the coming danger, while Chamberlain's optimism led to misjudgment. In the end, Churchill's realism proved far more accurate. Churchill's mental health challenges ran in his family. His father likely suffered from manic depression and died insane. His daughter Diana also had mental illness and died by suicide, and a cousin experienced lifelong depressive episodes. Churchill himself was sometimes suicidal, and his personal familiarity with suffering may have helped him grasp the true nature of the crisis ahead. He also managed his mood with the help of a psychiatrist, who prescribed him with amphetamines, and he regularly self-medicated with alcohol several times a day, further underscoring the intense psychological burden he carried as a wartime leader. Abraham Lincoln, like Churchill, suffered from depression and was at times suicidal. Rather than weakening him, his depression deepened his empathy, sharpened his realism, and fortified his perseverance. Mental illness ran in his family. His father and other relatives likely experienced depression as well. Unfortunately, treatments available at the time were primitive. Lincoln was prescribed bleeding, laxatives, and cold showers, as no antidepressants existed. Lincoln is remembered as a deeply kind and empathetic man, but also a cold realist. He opposed slavery on moral grounds, but understood the constitutional protections that upheld it in the South. As both a lawyer and a leader, he knew that abolition would require a constitutional transformation, and while he hoped for a peaceful end to slavery, he ultimately accepted war as the only viable path. Initially trying to unify both North and South, he was met with distrust by both sides. Once war broke out, he focused entirely on victory, not out of vengeance, but necessity. Lincoln's empathy didn't make him naive. He saw clearly that ending slavery wouldn't automatically mean true equality. He resisted triumphalism, recognizing that the South still harbored deeply rooted racism. Yet, even at the height of victory, he chose reconciliation over revenge. When your enemy is most vulnerable, when you could hurt him badly, that is when you must not do it. His moral clarity is reflected in his writings and speeches. In one striking letter, he lamented how America had twisted its founding ideals, saying that soon the creed "all men are equal" would exclude Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. He joked grimly that he'd prefer to move to Russia, where tyranny was at least honest. Though Lincoln legally ended slavery, he knew the deeper work remained unfinished. The task would fall to another empathetic and depressed leader, Martin Luther King Jr., who would not use military force, but soul force to finish what Lincoln began. Martin Luther King Jr., like Lincoln, was both depressed and deeply empathic. His philosophy of nonviolence was directly inspired by Gandhi, another depressed and empathic leader. He believed that nonviolence could heal society, even describing it as a way of curing white racists of a moral sickness. At its core, nonviolence was an act of love and transformation, both for the oppressed and the oppressor. Yet, King was no idealist in the naive sense. He was a realist who believed all people had the capacity for evil, some more than others, and acknowledged that violence was an unavoidable part of human nature. But in his view, non-violence wasn't about denying aggression. It was about mastering and redirecting it. True non-violence required channeling one's inner rage and pain into the courage to resist oppression without fighting back physically. He believed anger was essential to the Black freedom movement, not something to suppress, but something to transform. Non-violence, in his view, was not about being non-aggressive, but about being aggressive in a non-violent way. Like Gandhi, King believed that non-violence was not passive or weak. It was, in Gandhi's words, an extremely active force, one with no room for cowardice. Both men agreed that if the only choices were violent resistance or passive submission, violence was the better option. But non-violent resistance, they argued, was something greater, a spiritually aggressive stance that actively confronted evil without mirroring its brutality. It demanded strength, not surrender, resistance without retaliation. Shaped by both depression and empathy, Gandhi became even more devoted to non-violence as a path to change. Gandhi believed that even his adversaries, the British rulers of India, deserved respect and understanding. He distinguished between opposing a system and hating the people who upheld it. "I hate the system, but I do not hate domineering Englishmen," he wrote, affirming that his non-cooperation was rooted not in hatred, but in love. Though he ultimately failed to prevent the partition of India, he never abandoned his belief that empathy was the core of non-violence. Most miseries and misunderstandings in the world would disappear, he said, if we step into the shoes of our adversaries. He also understood empathy could be used as a political strategy, and believed that the suffering of the oppressed, when made visible through peaceful resistance, could stir the conscience of even the most powerful. Suffering opens the eyes of understanding, he claimed. His deep psychological insight into how empathy functions in human relationships made non-violence a revolutionary force. John F. Kennedy exhibited a hyperthymic personality, a temperament marked by high energy, sociability, optimism, risk-taking, and resilience in the face of adversity. This personality type, which Ghaemi identifies as a key contributor to psychological resilience, likely helped JFK endure a lifetime of serious health problems, including Addison's disease, a potentially fatal condition that weakened his immune system and required constant treatment with steroids. Despite frequent hospitalizations and near-death experiences, Kennedy maintained a sense of humor, charisma, and emotional strength, all characteristic of his temperament. Hyperthymic traits made Kennedy highly adaptive and curious, but also prone to excessive risk-taking, a pattern reflected not only in his leadership style, but also in his personal life. He had an extremely high libido, was known for his frequent sexual activity, including with prostitutes, and often took more medications than strictly necessary. These included steroids, amphetamines, procaine, and other drugs, many of which had psychiatric effects. At times, they enhanced his mood, energy, and leadership capabilities. At others, they may have contributed to episodes of mania or emotional instability. However, due to his Addison's disease, some of the more negative psychiatric side effects of steroids may have been blunted. Though JFK also experienced depressive episodes, he demonstrated a remarkable capacity to keep moving forward. His resilience wasn't just innate, it was forged through hardship and amplified by both his temperament and the medications that sustained him. His father, Joseph Kennedy Sr., likely shared the same hyperthymic traits, which may have been passed down to multiple members of the Kennedy family. This pattern of extreme risk-taking and emotional intensity may help explain what has been popularly dubbed the Kennedy curse, not as a supernatural phenomenon, but as the natural outcome of a volatile genetic inheritance. In the end, Kennedy's life exemplifies a paradox. His vulnerabilities and strengths were intertwined. His illnesses could have broken him, but instead, they shaped a leader who was bold, adaptive, and determined. A man who, as Nietzsche might say, was strengthened by what did not kill him. John F. Kennedy's leadership was shaped in part by his hyperthymic personality, a temperament marked by high energy, sociability, humor, and emotional resilience. Despite Despite suffering from Addison's disease and enduring frequent hospitalizations, Kennedy remained mentally strong and determined. His resilience was further supported by medications, including steroids, amphetamines, and painkillers, which, though not without side effects, often enhanced his mood, energy, and leadership performance. He stayed functional, focused, and charismatic even under enormous stress, a testament to how his mental temperament and drug regimen worked together to enhance, rather than undermine, his capacity to lead. But not all cases of mental illness and medication end in success. Adolf Hitler offers a dark counterexample. Like Kennedy, Hitler had a mental illness, likely bipolar disorder, and he too was heavily medicated while in power. Early in his rise, his manic traits may have enhanced his charisma, energy, and political creativity, but once in power, Hitler's condition was destabilized by an aggressive drug regimen administered by his personal physician, Theodore Morell. Unlike Kennedy, who received mostly intramuscular and oral treatments in carefully managed doses, Hitler was given daily and sometimes multiple intravenous amphetamine injections, along with opiates, barbiturates, steroids, and hormone mixtures. These drugs, combined with his underlying bipolar disorder, worsened Hitler's paranoia, grandiosity, and impulsivity, contributing to delusions, emotional instability, and erratic decision-making. Over time, he became increasingly isolated, aggressive, and obsessed with control, ultimately exhibiting signs of psychosis and issuing irrational orders in the final years of his regime. Together, Kennedy and Hitler illustrate how mental illness can influence leadership in radically different ways. Kennedy's temperament and treatment helped make him resilient and effective, while Hitler's illness, exacerbated by reckless medication, became a destructive force. The contrast powerfully underscores one of Ghaemi's key insights. Mental illness can enhance crisis leadership, but how it is managed can determine whether it becomes an asset or a disaster. With that said, this is not a defense of Hitler. While he likely had bipolar disorder and his medications worsened it, this does not excuse him from responsibility. As Ghaemi writes, those with mental illnesses are legally responsible for their actions, even when they commit the most heinous crimes. The medical and legal meanings of mental illness hardly overlap at all. Hitler knew what he was doing. Medically, he was mentally ill. Legally, he was responsible. There's no real psychiatric case that excuses him. No Hitler, no Holocaust. And yet, Hitler didn't build and sustain the Nazi regime alone. He was surrounded and supported by other top Nazi leaders who, by all clinical measures, were mentally healthy. Figures like Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Albert Speer, and Alfred Rosenberg showed no signs of depression, mania, or psychosis. They were generally stable, socially functional, and intelligent. Göring's IQ was 138, and others scored even higher. Most had no remorse for the Holocaust or the war. They regretted losing, not the violence they helped inflict. This leads to an uncomfortable truth. Profound evil is not always the result of mental illness. In fact, many atrocities are carried out by rational, mentally healthy individuals. Violence exists even in the psychologically well. The Nazi leadership, aside from perhaps Goebbels and Himmler who eventually committed suicide, was largely composed of psychologically stable people who believed in Hitler's mission and rationalized their actions. They weren't madmen, they were rational fanatics. As a first-rate madness suggests, mental illness may play a surprising role in leadership during crisis, but mental health is no guarantee of moral soundness. And this leads to a deeper point. Mental health doesn't always produce great leadership, especially in times of crisis. While we often associate sanity with strength and mental illness with weakness, the reality is more complicated. In calm and stable times, mentally sound leaders like Ronald Reagan or Harry Truman often perform well. But in moments of extreme stress and uncertainty, mental stability can actually become a liability. Rich Richard Nixon, for instance, was largely mentally healthy. No history of depression, bipolar disorder, or dangerous medications. Still, under pressure from Vietnam and Watergate, his judgment collapsed. He became paranoid, lashed out, blamed others, and refused to admit fault. His downfall wasn't the result of mental illness, but of rigidity and an inability to self-reflect during crisis. George W. Bush was also mentally stable, intelligent, emotionally even, and socially skilled. But after 9/11, he responded with black and white thinking. They attacked us, we must attack them. He lacked nuance, empathy, and the ability to see from the enemy's perspective. The war in Iraq was based on false claims, yet he never truly reconsidered the decision. That kind of moral stubbornness, while common, can be disastrous in leadership. In contrast, leaders like Lincoln, Churchill, King, and even Kennedy, each of whom battled some form of psychological struggle, often rose to the occasion precisely because of it. Their suffering gave them realism, resilience, and insight. As strange as it may seem, it is often the leader who has known despair who best leads others through it. So if you're struggling with depression, anxiety, or another mental illness, know this: you're not broken, and you're not alone. History shows that some of the greatest leaders didn't succeed despite their struggles, but because of them. Your pain may shape your strength, insight, empathy, and resilience, and these are powerful tools. You still have the capacity to do extraordinary things, maybe even to lead others through darkness, just as you've learned to face your own. As always, thank you so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below, and if you like this video, please leave a like and subscribe. Until next time.